Right then, I think we'll get started now. So good morning, everybody, as I've said. So thanks to everybody for joining today's session. My name is Kelly and I'm the Marketing Director here at Bespoke. Now, for those of you that haven't heard of us before, we are Power Platform specialists based out of Manchester. And a large part of what we do is work with Ingram partners to help them better understand how they can offer Power Platform as part of their service offering. So we do this through a number of partner education sessions, one of which is a Power Hour series. This series itself is made up of 4 Power Hours, one for each of the 4 Power Platform elements. So Power Automate, Power Apps, Power Virtual Agents, and today's session being Power BI. The session itself today is going to be delivered by my colleague Julius. He's one of the Power BI developers at Bespoke. And the goal for us is that by the end of the 1 hour, you have a better idea of what's possible with Power BI and also a clearer understanding of how it could complement your existing service offering. Now, there'll be 3 poll questions throughout the session today. These just help us to assess initial feedback. So if you're able to answer those, that would be very much appreciated. Now, if at any point you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. Julius is going to be pausing in places so that we can pick these up and address them. So in today's session itself, these are the agenda items that we're going to be covering off. So I will give you a little bit of a summary as to what Power BI is. Julius is then going to head into the platform itself and a little about licensing, how to create reports, how to use really good design on those, and how to share them. And then at the end of the hour, we'll just have a quick wrap up, any final questions, and we will discuss next steps. So what is Power BI? So I like to summarize it really simply as it's a powerful business analytics solution that allows you to visualize your data and share insights. Now, on that point about insights, that's really key because it allows you to get insights much faster. Just Power BI. You can create really interactive visualizations. There's lots of cool features within Power BI that really ensure you maximize the space you have on one screen. So Julius will be able to talk about some of those. Now, due to the numerous amount of connectors that are out there, Power BI offers seamless integration with various other business applications. So this in turn really allows businesses to scale effectively. I really do like to think of Power BI as the next logical step after Excel. It's really easy to connect to. As I mentioned, you can create really memorable reports, and in turn, it does allow businesses to make decisions much faster, that being due to the data interrogation capabilities that Power BI has to offer. So at this stage, as partners, I would really encourage you to have a think about what systems your clients are using, and of those systems, what built-in analytics do they offer? How many clients are likely to be exporting data from those systems in order to manipulate the data, make pivot tables, and present their own reports? Often this process takes a numerous amount of time, hours, even days, and Power BI removes the need for all of that. So if any of that sounds familiar, then I would say that there is a clear opportunity for you as a partner to be able to start talking to your clients about Power BI. So at that point, I'm going to hand over to Julius, who's going to run through this in a bit more detail.
Perfect. Thank you, Kelly. Good morning, everyone. Just a quick introduction to myself. My name's Julius. I'm a Power BI developer here at Bespoke. So my work is mainly just creating solutions internally and externally on Power BI, all the way from understanding and scoping out our clients' requirements to building and distributing those reports out. So just to reiterate the plan for today, just going to go over a little bit of an overview of the platform of Power BI and the licensing. We're going to run through some live demos as well, and I'm going to try and pause at the start of each of those demos in case any of you have any questions that you want to put in the chat. So we'll just be creating a report today, and then I'll show you how you get that up to the web and share it out. So let's get started. So in terms of the Power BI platform is made up of 3 components. The first component is Power BI Desktop, which is a free software for you to download on your Windows computer. It's where you'll typically build your data sets and your reports, and you don't need a license to download it or use it. You can use it for free without having any account with Microsoft or anything like that. Next, you have the Power BI service, which is basically where you'll share and collaborate on those reports that you build on Power BI Desktop. Now, you can actually create reports in the Power BI service as well. So if any of you are on Mac, you might want to do that because Power BI Desktop is a Windows-only application. But you will need a license in order to use the Power BI service. And also the Power BI service only works on the sort of default web browsers, or the most common web browsers, such as Chrome, Safari, Edge, and Firefox. Then finally, you have the Power BI mobile application, which is essentially the Power BI service on your phone. You can just use it to view and access your reports on your phone. You do need a license again because it's a cloud-based application, but the licensing that you have for the Power BI service will be the same as the Power BI mobile application because it's all linked into your Microsoft account. So this is a little flow of how those different components fit together. So it's typically how you will actually build or take your data and build your report and then share it out to your colleagues. So within Power BI Desktop, you'll connect to your data source. You will then build visualizations on that data. You will then publish that file up to the Power BI service, where you can then share and collaborate with your colleagues on the Power BI service on a web browser or on the Power BI mobile application. So in terms of licensing for using the cloud-based components of Power BI, there's two groups. You have the per user approach. So under that, you have the free per user license, which is only meant for personal use. The only way you can actually share and collaborate with it is share and collaborate on your reports is by sharing to the web, which means it's not secure, it's in the public domain, and you'll use desktop to create as normal. Then you have the pro per user license. So this, you're essentially paying for the ability to share with other people securely. So you can share with other users who have a pro per user license. Now, if you have an Office license ending with the number 5, you'll get a certain number of these Power BI Pro user licenses included within that. And the Pro per user license is the sort of standard or common choice of license, especially when you're unsure about what approach to make. You also have the Premium per user license, which is very similar to the Pro. Allows you to share securely with other Pro and Premium users, but you pay for more cloud computing power and space, so you get a better performance and scalability, as well as access to a whole host of premium features, which include AI capabilities such as sentiment analysis, machine learning models, which can help you forecast and predict things within your data. And you also get access to more storage, more refreshes, and things like that. But there's plenty of documentation out there for all the features that are available if you want to go down that route. Then you also have the per capacity approach for licensing. Now, the per capacity approach is typically just for very large organizations. It basically allows you to share securely with other users which have a free per user license, or in particular cases, no license at all, because it's a lot easier to manage if you have a huge amount of users. It becomes a more cost-effective approach when you have roughly 500 users in the organization. However, there are still use cases where it doesn't have to be for a large organization. There are still use cases where you can use it for smaller organizations as well. So in terms of building a Power BI report, we typically split it up into 3 different sections. The first, which is preparing your data. This is what we like to think is the most important part of this process, and it's where you should spend most of your time when building your report. You then have the visualization process, and then finally the third step is sharing and distributing your report. So when preparing your data, the things that you'll do is connect to your data source. You'll then clean and transform that data, build out your wider data model, so with the tables and other things from your data source, create relationships between those, and then you'll also build calculations which are called measures within Power BI. You'll then have the visualization, which is where you'll build your charts, you'll add any design or branding elements to it, and you also might want to think about adding some row level security, so that restricts data access to particular users at a row level. And then finally, you have sharing, which is where you'll publish that report that you build on Power BI Desktop up to the Power BI service, which you then share out with your colleagues. And then you can build what are known as dashboards and apps as well, which I'll run through later in this session. So the first two typically done on Power BI Desktop, which is what we would recommend, especially if you have a Windows laptop, and then the third on the Power BI service. However, if you are on Mac, you might be limited to only the Power BI service when building and creating your reports as well. So that brings us to our first demo. Now, just before I get into it, I'm just going to hand back over to Kelly to see if there are any questions in the chat that any of you have put in.
Not yet, Julius, no.
Okay, perfect. We'll hop in straight into our first demo then. So if none of you have done so already, you can download Power BI Desktop from the web using the following URL, powerbi.microsoft.com. Now, I think you might just be looking at a poll question right now, so I'll just pause for a couple of seconds before moving on to the next section. Kelly, are you able to pop the URL within the chat for everyone? If that's okay.
Yeah, just bear with me 1 second.
Thank you. So yeah, so this is the URL, guys. It's powerbi.microsoft.com. You'll then, under products, click Power BI Desktop, and that will give you two options. You can either go ahead and download Power BI, download it for free using this option here, which is what I would recommend because that opens the Microsoft Store on your Windows computer. Now, Microsoft release monthly updates to Power BI, and if you choose to download Power BI Desktop this route, then those updates will be pushed automatically to your application. So I'd recommend going down this route. However, you can download certain versions of Power BI using the other option, but that will mean when Microsoft push those updates, you'll have to re-download Power BI. So I'd recommend you just doing the download free option there. Now, once you've downloaded Power BI Desktop, you want to go ahead and open up the application, and you'll be greeted with a screen just like this. Now, the first thing we want to do today is we want to connect to some data. So in order to do that, we go up here and we click the Get Data option. Now, what Power BI is going to do is going to present us with a list of roughly 300 built-in connectors, so data sources that you can connect to out of the box with Power BI. And this includes your Excel workbooks, your SharePoint folders, SQL databases, Azure analysis services, all the sort of standard connections you would expect. Now, in some cases, you might not be able to connect to your data source out of the box using these connectors, in which case you might want to think about whether or not your data source has any API capabilities, or maybe even think about building a custom connector, which would require some external developer if you don't have someone with the right coding language skills in-house. Now, today, we're going to be connecting to a public data set. And that public data set is just from the Our World in Data GitHub repository, which all of you could access. Now, we're going to connect to CO2 data within that data set. And I definitely recommend you guys go ahead and try connecting to some public data sets, because I feel like it's really good practice when getting to know the Power BI desktop application, because it's data that you can understand and you can relate to as well. And that's what really helps you get the most out of building your reports as well. So what we're going to do today is connect to this CSV file, which is just CO2 data for all the countries in the world over a certain period of time, year on year. Now, I could go ahead and download this CSV and connect to the CSV directly on my desktop. However, I can actually just connect to the web and connect to the file straight away. So I'm just going to click View Raw, and we can see this content here, the CSV. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the URL and connect to it directly. So if we head back over to Power BI Desktop, there is a connector called the Web Connector, which essentially just allows you to enter a URL of a website and it will extract the information that it can from that website. So I'm just going to paste the URL into that URL entry option, and then Power BI is going to connect to that website for me. Now, Power BI is going to offer me a preview of the data that we wish to connect to, which is really useful because it helps you understand whether or not you need to make any changes or transformations to your data before loading it into your data model. Now, I can see here that my data is in quite good format, but there are a lot of columns and I don't actually need those columns to build our report today. So instead of loading it straight into my data model, I'm going to go ahead and click the Transform Data option instead. Now what that's going to do is that's going to open up what's known as the Power Query Editor. Now, some of you might be familiar with the Power Query Editor. It's built into Excel as well. I'm just going to drag it over to my correct screen here. It's built into Excel, so some of you might have used it before. Now, I'm going to go ahead and make a few transformations within the Power Query Editor. And don't worry if you don't follow this or lose me on this. This is the most technical part of this session. Power Query is a very useful and powerful tool, which is why I want to introduce it to you today. However, you might not end up spending too long in it, but I thought I'd show you a few of the basics of Power Query today. So Power Query itself is based on a coding language called M. Now that might sound quite scary, but you can do 99% of the things using the user interface that has been provided for you. So it's essentially a very low code platform. So we can see up at the top here, there's lots of different options and buttons for us to go ahead and transform our data, add any columns, do any calculations and things like that. Whenever we actually make a change to our data within Power Query, Power Query records the change we made in this applied steps area on the right hand side. And that's quite useful because it means you can step back and forth between the steps you make. So you can see the state of data when you made certain steps, and you can also delete any steps that you don't want. However, I would say edge on the side of caution when deleting steps because there isn't a Control Z or a back button in Power Query. Essentially, the way you move forward and back is by clicking the steps. But if I go ahead and delete this step called change type, then I won't be able to recover it. So just bear that in mind. So the first thing we're going to do is select the columns that we want to bring into our data model. Now, in order to do that, you could go ahead and right-click a column and remove it, but there's a much simpler way of doing this. We can just use this choose columns function up here. And then we can select the columns that we wish to keep. So I'm just going to keep the first 4, and then I'm going to press OK. And I can see that my step has been applied on the right-hand side here. We can see the state of data before I applied that step. And then this is the state of data now. Now the next thing to do is typically check the data type of those columns. So we can see the data type quickly by just looking at the icon next to the header. I can see that all of those data types are what I expect, but if you wish to change them, you can just click on that icon and then change that data type there. Another thing that I notice about this data is underneath the header, there's this bar. Now most of it is green, but there's some that's gray, and if I hover over it, I can actually find out a little bit more about about the data within that column. So I can see 14% of that column is actually empty. Now, if I wanted to find out why that was, one way of doing that is I can click on this down arrow on that column, and I can select the blank values. And then I can see within the country column that there's actually a continent. And if I go ahead and click the drop down on the country column and load all the values that I can select, I can see that a lot of these are continents or others. They're not countries, and so we don't want continents within our data because it's going to skew our country data quite a lot. So I'm just going to delete that step that we've applied to go back to our data beforehand. And what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to remove all of those blanks to get rid of those continents. And then we can see the entire bar has now gone green. Now, one more thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to remove one more country because I know it's hiding in there. If I scroll down to all the countries that I have access to, I can see that a value for the world is in there. I'm going to remove that to prevent any skewing of the data also. And then we can see that it has been added into the code within the filtered roads step that we added in before. Now, the final thing to do now that our data is clean is to make it a little bit more presentable. So I'm going to go ahead and change the name of our table. And I'm also going to go ahead and capitalize these headers so that it looks a little bit more presentable when we drag these different columns onto our Power BI report canvas. And I also know that this is the CO2 production as well. And if you wanted to find out why I know that, it's within the details of the data set on the GitHub repository. So now our data is ready to be loaded into our data model. So in order to do that, we just hit the close and apply button up here. And then Power BI is going to think about things for a few seconds. It's going to load in those rows. And it's also going to try and create any connections within our data model. In our case, we're only loading in one table, so there's going to be no connections between different tables there. So it should be relatively fast when loading in the data. It also will tell us the number of rows within our data set when loading it in, so that can also be quite useful. So you can see there that we have roughly 22,000 rows within our data set. So I'd just like to bring your attention to the right-hand side here. After that's loaded, we can now see our table is within our fields pane on the right-hand side. And I can expand our table to see the different columns within our table there. Now, Power BI is a drag and drop experience. So you can just drag columns onto the report canvas, and Power BI can be intelligent, and it's going to try and essentially draw a graph that it feels that's suitable for the data that's within that column. So say we take our country column, and I just drag it onto the report canvas here. Power BI is going to be intelligent, and it's essentially just going to plot a map for me there. So I can see on the visualizations pane, the visual that it has selected for me is the map visual. And then I can see that it's plotted all of those different countries, and I can drag that map around like that. I can also reposition it on the canvas and align it just like on a PowerPoint. So I'm just going to make it a little bit larger, and we can see our map of the different countries just like that. Now, there's a few other different ways you could go about and draw a graph. You could also start from blank, and you could select the visual you wanted to start with. So we could select the line chart option, and then we have a blank line chart which we can then begin adding detail to. So just like before, we could drag the year column onto our visual, and Power BI will be intelligent, and it will try and plot the graph it feels that it's suitable based on that data. But in this case, I'm going to do a different option. I'm going to actually drag it into these buckets here on the right-hand side. So the axis one is the x-axis in our case, and the values will be the y-axis. So I want the year to go along the x-axis of our visual, and then we can have the CO2 production along the y-axis of our visual. And it thinks about it for a second, and then it plots the graph just like that. So there's a few different ways you can actually go about creating these graphs. Now, you can also change the chart type. So I could go ahead and be like, oh, I don't think this looks that great as a line chart. So I could actually make it an area chart instead. And I can just click the area chart and it'll change it for me, just like that. But we're just going to hop back to the line chart for now. So just a little bit more on the UI within Power BI Desktop. We've already gone over our Get Data option up here. To the right of that, there are some common data sets that you can connect to, so they're just shortcuts for the data sources. You can also enter data manually if you want. So obviously, probably avoid that unless it's just a couple of rows that you're entering. You can, if say for example, the transformations you made didn't quite clean the data the way you wanted to, or you need to make more transformations, you can go ahead and open up the Power Query editor again by clicking on this transform data option up here. The refresh, now what that does is refreshes the connection between your Power BI report and your data source, so it will pull the latest data from your data source. You can add some customizations and visuals here. The new visual option is exactly the same as if you were adding some visuals over here. It's just a different option. If you just depends on what you feel most comfortable with and what suits you. You can add text boxes, yes, so think about adding headers and things like that to your reports. You can add some more visuals there. You have the option to add your measures, so your calculations within Power BI. So we're going to go ahead and create a measure. Now, measures within Power BI Desktop are written in the language DAX. Now, DAX is very, very similar to the language that you're probably already familiar with in Excel. So I wouldn't worry about learning any new formula language there. And it also comes with an IntelliSense that's very similar to Excel. So if you're unsure on the function to use, you can begin typing out what you think would be the function, and then it will come up with a few different options. So one of the things that we could do is we could create a measure that was the average the CO2 production. So I'm going to call it average CO2 production. I'm going to say that it equals the average, so we can see that IntelliSense working there. And then we're going to enter our CO2 production column, close the brackets, and press enter. And then Power BI on the right hand side is going to add it there. And we can tell it's a measure because it has the little calculator icon next to it. So now we can actually create a graph using this measure. So I'm going to create a stacked bar chart. I'm going to move that to the bottom right of my canvas, resize it, and I'm going to put the country along the y-axis in this case, and then I'm going to make our values the average CO2 production. So we can see the average CO2 production over all of the years as a little leaderboard there by country. Coming back up here, you have the publish option. Obviously, this is what gets your Power BI report from desktop up to the Power BI service, and we'll do a little example of that later within this session. The insert option, essentially these are just shortcuts to the different visuals that are also available to you here. So again, just personal preference on how you prefer to add and create your visuals. Again, thinking about any sort of design elements here. Buttons are very powerful within Power BI Desktop. They can help with page navigation, hiding and unhiding visuals. So I definitely recommend you having a play around with those. You can add images. So again, thinking about maybe some logos, some branding, any background images and things like that. Under the modeling option, this is mainly just the calculation area. So you have your measures. You can add new columns to your data table, again, using the language DAX, so it's all consistent from that point of view. You can also actually create tables using the language DAX as well. So that can be quite a powerful tool. However, you might want to go ahead and research the functions that are available to you within the DAX language to do that, as that's probably something that's quite new to you. But I definitely recommend having a look at that. Your what if parameters. So essentially what your what if parameters are variables that you can allow an end user to change. And you can actually use the value of that variable within your calculations or your measures. So that way the user can actually interact with a variable and see what changes it makes to the report and any sort of fluctuations and things on the graphs. So you can almost see your data changing live. And then you have your row level security. So you're just referred to as your security here. And you can actually create your roles as well as test them within Power BI Desktop, which is quite interesting. And again, this is in the language DAX, so it's all consistent. Under View, you have options to add in your own custom theme to your Power BI report. Now, I'd recommend that as well. That will save you a lot of time when it comes to branding and customization of your visuals there. You can create some custom mobile layouts for your reports. You can think about so grid lines, snapping to grid and locking objects. That just helps you as a report creator to kind of distribute all your visuals within your report page clearly and cleanly. Bookmarks is what I was referring to before with buttons, where you can hide and unhide visuals. And you can also think about analyzing the performance of your reports. So by running the performance analyzer, it will tell you what visuals are taking the longest time to load and why that is, whether or not it's because of a massive DAX calculation engine behind it, or whether or not it's just because of the sheer amount of data that is within that visual itself. Then the help option just gives you links to some Microsoft resources as well as the Power BI community, so that you can go and learn some more. You can get some guided training videos and things like that. And then obviously the community is really useful because that is where people put questions to other Power BI developers and things like that. So I imagine if you are unsure of how to do something, chances are someone's already asked the same question and it's on the Power BI community on the web, or you can go ahead and ask the Power BI community as well, because I'm sure some people out there will respond.
Julius, just on that point that you make there about questions, just had a quick question, which is how frequently can you refresh the dashboards from the data source?
Sorry, repeat that, Kelly.
How frequently can you refresh the dashboards and the data?
So on Power BI Desktop, you can do it as many times as you like. When you then go to the Power BI service, you can manually do it as many times as you like. So you can manually go in and click refresh. But obviously that can be a little bit cumbersome if you're having to go in and doing that quite a lot. So you also have the option to schedule refreshes. Now, the number of refreshes that you can schedule depends on your license type. So coming back to the per user licenses that I mentioned earlier, with a pro per user license, you can schedule up to 8 refreshes on a single report in 24 hours. Now, if you have a premium per user license, that is an extra sort of premium feature that comes with that, is that 8 becomes 48 instead. So you can refresh your data. You can schedule refreshes on your data every half an hour with your premium per user license. So depending on how up to date you want your data, might depend on the license type approach that you take as well. So hopefully that answers your question.
Perfect, thanks, Julius.
No worries. So just coming back to Power BI Desktop and running through a few more features of what's available to you within the UI. Currently, we are looking at the report view, so where we design our visuals. Down here, we can actually change to the data view, so we could select the different tables within our data and see the data itself, and also begin filtering the data. Now, any sort of filters that you apply here, don't worry, they won't be applied to your report. This is just kind of for you to interrogate your data without having any sort of impact on anything else. Then finally, you have the data model view, which is where you can create connections between the tables within your model. So we're going to go ahead and actually create a connection quickly. I'm going to connect to an Excel workbook, which I created earlier. And this Excel workbook is just a list of the countries that are within our CO2 data, but it lists the continent they're in as well. So what this essentially will allow us to do is it will allow us to analyze the data that we have imported by continent now also. So if I select the table, I can see the preview of the data here. So as you can see, it's just a list of countries with the continents. And you just tick next to that table to load it into your model. Now, I'm not going to go ahead and make any transformations because I don't need to. It's already in the format that I need. So I'm going to go ahead and click load instead. And so Power BI is going to skip out the Power Query editor and it's going to just bump it straight into my data model itself. Now what you can see is Power BI again has been intelligent. It's already analyzed the columns within that data source that I've just connected to. and it's created a connection between the CO2 data and that list of countries. If I hover over this connection, I can see that it's on the country column, which is what I expect. And you can also see that this is a one-to-many relationship, which is also correct. And the reason why that's correct is because there is one row for each country within the Excel file that we just connected to, whereas there are many rows for a single country within the CO2 data because we have many years for each of those countries. So that is why it's a one-to-many relationship. Now, because this is also called Table 1, I'm just going to rename it to something a little bit more generic, such as geography. And I just did that by double-clicking the name of the table in the fields pane there. And you can see that's renamed geography. So now if we jump back to our report, I can go ahead and think about analyzing this data by continent now. So perhaps I want to change the colors on my map by continent. You can see that that is adjusted just like that. And perhaps I want to break down CO2 production over all of our years by continent also. So I could create a stacked column chart. I'll move that over to the right-hand side also. Align it with my other visuals. Drag and drop the year to the x-axis. Add our CO2 production to our y-axis. And then add our continent to our legend. Just like that. And it's going to think about it for a second. You can see it loading in the top left. And then you can see we now have our stacked bar chart by continent for CO2 production for all of those years. So that sort of is a little bit of an overview of the UI that's available to you within Power BI Desktop. We are going to build out this report a little bit more, so don't worry about that. But just before I do that, I'm just going to head back over to our PowerPoint slide and run through a few things with you. So one of the things that is very important when building your report is the report design. Now, one thing that you should always think about doing is planning out your report, whether or not that's drawing wireframes and things like that. You can draw it out on paper if you wish, or you can create something on PowerPoint. Now, one thing that we like to do is we like to create backgrounds on PowerPoint. And the reason why that is because PowerPoint and Power BI out of the box both have the same canvas size. So if you create a background on PowerPoint, you can just select all of it, save it as an image, and then import it into Power BI. And then it fits perfectly within your Power BI background. So PowerPoint is a really useful tool, especially when combined with Power BI as well. Just a sort of a design tip is think about contrast. So a lot of the reports we build have a slightly darker background to the visuals, so it helps the visuals stand out a little bit more instead of having them floating within a sort of a blank canvas. So you can see here we've got a slightly grayed background on these reports, even a shadow in some places, because it really helps those visuals stand out. Also, when designing your reports, think about navigation possibly. So you might want the user to have a more app-like experience, so building in buttons and things like that in order to allow the user to select between pages. And so we can see on this example up here, we have a little navigation bar along the left-hand side where the users can actually click those icons and it will take them to different pages within the reports. And also don't be afraid of taking inspiration from other reports or the reports here, or even websites, because essentially websites will have a similar navigation experience. So definitely think about that. So just before we get onto our second demo, again, going to hand over to Kelly if there are any questions that I can help answer from any of you.
No further questions just yet, Julius, but probably what I would just say at this point, particularly on the data that you've just been through, is for people to think about their clients and what external data sets they may use. So an example there being any clients within healthcare. There are numerous data sets publicly available, particularly within healthcare, but also across lots of other different sectors. And quite often what clients will do is try and obtain those data sets, manipulate them manually, and try and make some sort of sense from them. And when using Power BI, it allows us to simplify that process much more easily, and also for them to overlay their own data and information over the top of it. So with that, in turn, you get really rich dashboards and insights. So again, that's just a point that I'd ask you to sort of bear in mind.
Thank you, Kelly. So we're just going to go ahead and run back to our report, and we're just going to build it out a little bit more and think about adding some of the design elements that we just spoke about also. So we actually have our visuals sort of already built here, but what we might want to think about doing is drilling down and filtering our visuals. So just like within Excel and Power Pivot tables and things like that, you have slices. So we can add a slicer visual to our report page, and then we can add possibly the continent. So I'm also going to just go ahead and tick next to that continent, because that is also another way of adding it to our visual. So now we have our list of continents, and we have the option to select the different continents. So I could select Asia and Europe, and that will filter all of my visuals for me. And then I can clear that selection by just clicking the eraser button up here. Now we're going to create one more as well for our countries. I'm going to tick next to the country column, and it's going to add it automatically for me. And then obviously this is quite a long list, so you might want to provide your users with the option to search. And in order to do that, you can click on the ellipsis up here and then click search, and then that will add a little search bar. So now we could go ahead and search for a single country, let's say the United Kingdom, and then we can select that, and then that will filter all of our data as well for us. So we'll clear that selection also. Now, we also might want to think about the branding and the design. So typically when you do this, you can select the visual, and then if you come under the visualization pane over here, you can go to the format your visual option, and then that will give you the option to design and customize lots of different elements within your visual. So the x-axis, the y-axis, you can play around with any backgrounds or borders and things like that also. However, as you can imagine, doing this on a lot of visuals is going to be quite time consuming. And so that's why what we're going to do is we're going to import a custom theme instead. So in order to do that, we go over to the view option, and then what we can do is we're going to browse for some themes, because we already have one here at Bespoke. And I'm just going to go ahead and open that theme, and then we can see that all of the visuals have changed based on our color scheme, and also all of the fonts have changed based on whatever font, in this case DIN, that we have selected to be included within our theme. And also a border has been added to every single visual also, because I feel like that helps separate out the visuals as well. So that's also a good visualization tip. Now the next thing you want to do is add a background to your report. So in order to do that, you can, without having any visuals selected, you can come under the format option up here, and you can go to your canvas background, and you can click browse for image. And we already have one that I created earlier within PowerPoint, and I can go ahead and open that, and then I can make it fit to my report canvas, and then we can see that background has been added there. Now, one thing that we like to do is we like to add a little header to our reports, because sometimes these slices along the left-hand side, they can take up a lot of space within your report, and so you can utilize that space a lot better. So what we can do is we can turn these lists into drop downs, and we can reduce the size of them, and then we can move them to this header area, and then so they're out the way, and then we have more space for our actual visuals. And it also helps to group the different slices also, because you could have quite a few different slices, that you want the user to have access to in order to drill down into your data, and it's quite nice to group them within this header on the page itself. And so now we have a lot more space to play with for our visuals. We can make them a lot bigger, and so the users will hopefully get a little bit more out of those visuals because of that. So now we pretty much have a report which is ready to be published up to the Power BI service and ready to be distributed out to our users. Now, just before we go ahead and actually publish this up to the Power BI service, I'm just going to run through what it is that you actually publish when you publish your report. So when you save your Power BI report, essentially what you have within it is the report itself. So this is essentially the report that we've just created, and it's just the front end visuals that the user interacts with. And then you also have the data set. So this is the table, the data within those tables, the connections between the tables, as well as the calculations as well. And so when you publish your Power BI file up to the Power BI service, you essentially expose both of these components. And the reason why that's really useful is because if your data set is exposed, it means that other users can connect to a data set, that data set that you've built. So it helps you create a single source of truth, but it also helps reduce the duplication of efforts, because if someone's building a similar report, without exposing this data set, they might have to recreate that data set within Power BI Desktop again. Whereas because that data set is exposed, it can save them a lot of time, and they can just connect to a data set already built, which gives them what they want. And so all they need to do is build out visuals instead of thinking about the data model again. So that's a really useful thing to know. Also, when you publish your Power BI report, it obviously needs to go somewhere within the Power BI service. So that somewhere are workspaces. And you can just think of workspaces as folders. So just like SharePoint has folders, Power BI has workspaces. Now, there's two different main types of workspaces. You have your personal workspace. So when we were talking about the free per user license earlier and how it has limited sharing capabilities, that's because it can actually, with that license, you can only publish up to your own personal workspace, and no one else can access anything within your own personal workspace. However, if you have at least a pro per user license, you can then think about publishing out to app workspaces. And the reason why they're referred to as app workspaces is because you can create what is known as an app for the workspace, which I'll run through in a second. So just reviewing what dashboards are before we get onto our apps. So let's say we created 3 different Power BI desktop reports, and we published all 3 of those reports up to the Power BI service into a single app workspace. What we can then do is we can take components from each of those reports. And by components, I mean individual visuals, or maybe even a whole report page. But we can take components from each of those reports and we can add them to what is known as a dashboard, which is essentially just a one-pager of key KPIs and visuals that you will try and use to kind of help bring those different reports together into a single story. And they also work really well with apps. So what an app is to, again, think about that workspace with our 3 reports and a dashboard that we've just created. And we can package all of that up into what is known as an app, which essentially puts that dashboard and those 3 reports into a single area for a user to access. And the reason why this is really useful is basically because of sharing. So within Power BI, there's quite a few different ways for you to actually share your content. So you can actually share at a reports level. So say we had our app workspaces, we could share those 3 reports individually, but it would mean sending out a link for each of those reports. So if you had 10, 20 reports within a single workspace, if you were sharing at a report level, that would mean that users would have to keep track of 10, 20 links to those different reports. Whereas with an app, it puts it all in one place, and so you can send out one link which contains all of those reports and dashboards already. So it's a lot easier when it comes to distribution. So definitely think about that as well when you're thinking about sharing and collaborating. You can also share at a dashboard level also. Bear in mind that if you share a dashboard, you basically will share any reports that have any components put on that dashboard. So if we shared dashboard 1 in our example, we would have to give the user access to report 1, 2, and 3 as well, because they have components on that dashboard. You can also give someone access to a whole workspace and give them certain permissions within that workspace. So whether or not that's creating, editing content, adding different users, just viewing content, so just being a reader of the workspace, and being an admin as well, so being able to do anything. You can also add Power BI to Teams. Now, essentially what this is, it's just the Power BI service within your Teams application. And you can also add apps, reports, and things like that to different channels. And that really helps you to increase the the collaboration aspect within your teams. And also you can add comments within those channels to those reports as well. So it's really useful from that collaboration side. And then finally, you also have the option to share your content out to the web. So that brings us to our third and final demo. Again, just one last time, I'm going to hand over to Kelly if there are any questions that I can help answer.
Nothing just yet, Julia, thank you.
Perfect, thank you. So what we're going to do now is we're going to publish our Power BI report up to our Power BI service and think about creating a dashboard, an app, and look at sharing that content out. So in order to publish the report, the first thing we need to do is actually save the report, and make sure that when you save it, the name that you provide it with is the name that it will be exposed as within the Power BI service. So just bear that in mind when naming your report. So we're going to call this our Power Hour report. And because I've already clicked the publish option, Power BI is then going to present me with all the workspaces that I have access to in order to publish. I already have created one called the Power Hour workspace, so I'm going to publish it into that workspace. Now, the time it takes to publish depends on quite a few things, the amount of data, the number of visuals and pages within your report and things like that. So just bear that in mind. Ours is quite a small file, so it doesn't take very long for it to publish. We can see it's successfully published there, and we can go ahead and open it directly by clicking the open option there. And that's going to take us straight to the Power BI service and straight to that report. Now, you can also access the Power BI service by just going to the original URL, which is app.powerbi.com. And that is just going to take you to the homepage within the Power BI service. And it's going to look something like this. And then you can find all of the workspaces that you have access to under the workspaces option here. So just coming back to our Power Hour report, we can see it here. And now we have a fully interactive report available on the Power BI service, which we can now share out with our users. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create a dashboard. Now, in order to create one, the simplest way to do it is just hover on the visual that you wish to add to that dashboard, and you'll see a little pin icon here which says pin visual. So say we wanted to add this visual to a dashboard, we can pin it. Currently, there isn't a dashboard that exists within this Power Hour workspace, so we have to create one in order to pin it, and we'll call it our Power Hour dashboard, and we'll click pin. That's successfully pinned to our dashboard. Now, I'm just going to go back to the Power Hour workspace itself. Now, we can see the two components of our Power BI file here. We have our report and we have our data set that we've published. Here we have our Power Hour dashboard itself, so the dashboard that we just pinned a visual to. And up here we have another report which I published into this workspace a little bit earlier. And if we go into this report as well, this is essentially just a greenhouse gas emissions report which we made for Earth Day. And we're going to also pin a visual from this report into the dashboard that we've just created. So let's say we want to pin this emission growth visual. I can just click pin here, and I can pin it to the existing dashboard that we just created, just like that. And then I can go to that dashboard, and then we can see the two different visuals that we've pinned there. Now, we're just going to head back to our workspace again, and now we're going to think about creating an app. So in order to do that, you'll have a create app option up here. Mine says update app because I have actually already created one in this workspace, but the process is the exact same. You can go ahead and click create app, give it a name, give it a description. You can add an app logo and a color theme. And then you can think about navigation. So one thing that's really useful is making the dashboard the landing page on your app. And you'll see why in a second. So I've just moved it up to the top, so it's the landing page of our app. Under permissions, you can then add the users you wish to share this app with. And then under links, you can copy and paste that app link and then send that out to your users so that they can access the app. So once you've done that, you'll click create, or in my case, update. It will then publish the app, and then you can click go to that app, and then it's going to land on the dashboard for us. Now, one of the great things about a dashboard, which is why it's so useful with an app, is if you click the visual, so say this visual, which came from our Power Hour report, what's going to happen is it's going to take me straight to that report where that component came from. So this dashboard also makes a good navigation, which is why it makes a good landing page within your app as well. So if I click the emission growth visual, that will take me to the other reports within our workspace as well. And you can see here everything within our workspace is just in one place, and so we can share it all out in one go. Now, just a few more things to run through before we wrap up the session is if I go back to our workspace, our Power Hour workspace here, I've just shown you how you can share out your app. If you wish to share out just at a report level, you can just hover on the report and click the share icon, enter the email address or the name of the user you wish to share to. You can do the same with the dashboard as well. And then the final thing you'll probably want to think about is keeping your reports up to date. So just coming back to the question that I answered earlier, this refresh now button is a manual refresh. You have unlimited of those. But if you go to the schedule refresh option, you'll have a limitation on the number of refreshes that you can schedule based on the license type that you have. But you can come under the schedule refresh option, click on, and then you can begin thinking about the frequency, and you can add times. And obviously, eventually, it won't let you add any more times depending on your license type. So that brings our session to a close for today. Thank you for listening. Hopefully it gives you enough to get started with your own Power BI journey. And I'll hand you back over to Kelly.
Thank you, Julius, and thank you everybody for attending. We really hope that it allowed you to better understand Power BI and how it can help your business and in turn that of your clients. If you would like to discuss how you can partner with us, then do feel free to get in touch. Alternatively, for those of you that would like to delve deeper into the world of BI development, you can sign up to our May dashboard in half-a-day session, details of which will be sent to you following today's session. So yeah, any questions, do feel free to reach out. If not, then thanks again and have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you, everyone.